Radio check, anybody copy? Hi, everybody. I'm Alice Kaniklen, and this is a special live episode 11 featuring author and professor Bathsheba Demuth on Coffee and Quark. This episode was held in partnership with the Anchorage Museum at Rasmuson Center SEED Lab. And I sat down with Bathsheba to discuss her life and work as an environmental historian specializing in the lands and seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. So let's just get right into it.
Imagine the Arctic as a place where you can see the relationship between human beings and their broader environments as one that are interdependent and interconnected rather than being kind of just one of humans making a series of decisions through time that are completely independent.
Okay, great. Thank you guys for being here. Welcome. Paglarivsi Uvangakanik. I'm Alice Kaniklen. I am the host and producer of the Coffee and Quark podcast. And for those of you that don't know what Coffee and Quark is a podcast to celebrate and explore contemporary Native life in urban and rural Alaska. And we are here at the SEED Lab, hosted so graciously by the Anchorage Museum. Thank you so much for having us to have a sit-down conversation with Miss Bathsheba Demuth. Did I get your name right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Who is an environmental historian and Brown University professor and author of the amazing book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Alice.
I appreciate that. And so I wanted to sit down and catch you while you were in town here doing a bunch of different events so that we can have a Coffee and Quark discussion about your book, which I'm so excited. I just started reading your book on my way back home to Utrecht a couple of weeks ago. I was there for 2 weeks, and it really made me examine my own connection to the place that I grew up, not just environmentally, but also, the people and the culture and the animals. So it was, you opened the book through the eyes of a bowhead whale. And that's what really drew me in, because that's something I really connected with growing up, right? So I thought that, using that as a tool to connect with people or to connect with me, that was my conduit into your book. And I was like, holy cow, this is so fitting. This is amazing. But will you please introduce yourself to some of our listeners who might not know who you are?
Sure. So as you said, I'm an environmental historian, which is just a fancy way of saying that instead of studying history as just a thing that people do, I study history as a thing that's made by people, but also by other kinds of beings in the world and natural processes. So everything from bowhead whales to the way in which climates change over time and cultures change with them or don't change with them. And I teach at Brown University. My background, I was trained as a historian of Russia, and then kind of came to this project about the Bering Strait because I became a Russian historian because what I was really interested in was the Arctic. And I was interested in the Arctic because when I was 18, I moved to a little village in the Canadian Arctic, a Gwich'in village on the Porcupine River called Old Crow, instead of going to university. And I ended up staying there for almost 3 years, like over 2 years. Wow. And my main job was to train sled dogs. So I just spent a lot of time figuring out, as I say, I think in the introduction to the book, figuring out how not to die in the Arctic. Because I come from a little town in Iowa, so like the way that I grew up and what I needed to learn how to do and learn how to relate to the world was pretty different by the time I got up north. And I think that being up there that amount of time and learning from the land that I was on, and then also from my host family, how to live there really kind of changed the way that I thought about history. And I didn't know it at the time because I was young and, pretty brash and didn't think much about anything. I didn't put it in a lot of context, but it made me really pay attention to the ways in which people and the environments around them are kind of in this constant ongoing dialogue, rather than it being sort of people making a series of decisions and landscapes or species or whatever else just kind of falling in line. Because it's so clear when you're up here that that's really not how things work. It's more complicated and it's more of a dialogue than that.
Yeah. More nuanced.
More nuanced, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and kind of how you got to this? So this is an interesting story to me. It's like, how did you find yourself in an Arctic village, So
I grew up in a little town in Iowa. So serious agricultural country, corn everywhere, no bears, no wolves, most of those species had been pushed out, right? I was really in serious settler colonial country. But always was really interested in writing and photography. And as I was kind of in high school, I didn't actually go to high school. I was homeschooled by my parents. So I hadn't been to school at all, which maybe is why I was open to the idea of like putting off college for a while. I realized I didn't know what I wanted to study in college, and it's expensive. It takes a long time.
Right.
It didn't make any sense to me to spend thousands and thousands of dollars just because that was the next thing I was supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And I managed to convince my parents that this is also
a good idea.
A good idea. Critically, because without them, really being kind of okay with this, I never would have done it.
It's like you're before your time with that one, because I feel like a lot of us got sucked into, if you want to be successful in life at all, you go to college,
right. And I know my parents actually got a lot of grief from friends who had kids of the same age, because they're like, don't get your daughters like crazy ideas. Don't let them rub off on our kids. Like, they need to go right to college. So I made some people nervous, I guess. But I think one of the things that kind of came out of that background, because I was homeschooled, I had a lot of time on my own, and I tended to spend a lot of it outside and in what woods remain in Iowa. And I had a real interest in going to places where I could kind of learn more about, living a more subsistence lifestyle, or just living differently than the kind of agricultural way that was all around me. How I ended up in this village in the Arctic is... some of it honestly remains a mystery. I found a very kind of ad hoc organization in Massachusetts that would sell you access to their list of places that would take on, 18-year-olds with a high school diploma.
Wow.
And somehow or other, my host family, my host father, Stan and Jutely, got his name on this list. And so I called him up out of the blue and asked if he needed a dog handler. And he said yes. And so I bought a one-way ticket to Old Crow, and somehow my mother put me on an airplane. She says she still cries on the anniversary of my leaving, because I think it was pretty hard on her.
I can imagine. So, because I remember when I left for school too. So I went straight from Barrow we flew from Barrow to Phoenix, and then drove 2 hours north of Phoenix to Flagstaff, and it felt like the middle of nowhere, And I was like,
and the desert.
Don't leave me, yeah. Because she had to drop me off, and then I was supposed to just go to school, and I was. I remember standing there with my mom. I had no friends. I didn't even know where I was. I don't even think we had maps or GPS on our phone then. It was like.
Yeah, you're really just dropped off.
Yeah, in this strange red land.
Hot.
But yeah, I cried, and my mom cried too, because she knew that I was probably going to be, struggling in a way.
Yeah.
That's got to be hard for your mom to go ahead, fly up north.
It'll be fine.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you're homeschooled, which is interesting because you were homeschooled, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes folks that are homeschooled have a different, an unconventional learning style. And I was when I was up in Barrow, I was interviewing some folks at Ilisarvik College, the tribal college there. And what was really cool and exciting was that their approach to the Inupiaq Studies program was to also cater to a different learning style that Indigenous people many Indigenous people have, just a very hands-on. We're not so much like sit down and
memorize
pay attention
things
and memorize, and write it down, So, did you have a different, would you say you had an unconventional learning style kind of growing up?
I think so. In part because I'm mildly dyslexic, so I didn't learn how to read till I was 9. And I think if I had been in school, the kind of pressure to conform to you're supposed to read at a certain age, and that's just what you're supposed to do, would have been really different. And I'm sure that my mom was, concerned about it, and she was doing all the fretting. But to me, I just sort of learned to read when my brain could figure out how to process symbols that way. And I listened to stories. I listened to my mom read aloud to me. I was around kind of language all the time and loved it. But I still have a really kind of sketchy grasp of how to turn sounds into symbols. So I think that was different. And I think I have always been kind of drawn, as much as I love reading and love kind of textual things, to the relationship that those have to experience and to kind of doing things in the world, and being able to move back and forth between those is something that being homeschooled allowed me to do. And also it didn't take as much time out of a day. I had a lot more kind of independent time because I was essentially tutored by my mom and my dad to a small degree. And so there wasn't a lot of busy work or homework that was just there to kind of keep people occupied while the teacher could spend a little bit of time one-on-one with everybody in a lesson. So I just had a lot more time to write things and go mess around in the woods and do that sort of stuff. Which I don't know what that would have looked like if I was sort of in the much more regimented kind of classroom space. And I think also made it easier when I got up to Old Crow and all of the learning was experiential. It's not like I was reading guidebooks to dog mushing or how to field dress a caribou. Those are applied skills, and you really only learn how to do them or get better at them by practicing them and watching people do them and then trying to imitate what they're doing in yourself until you can kind of use your own body in the same way. So I think it also helped in that sense that I liked learning that way.
Yeah, I think there's that in order to learn, any skills in the Arctic, it happens a lot just by watching, and not even by really being told. It's like you're right, an experiential thing. I just thought it was really cool that Ilisarvik was catering to that, and they're like, well, let's try it this way, and it was also, we don't have one person that can teach everything. I mean, we probably could, but it just, they wanted it to be a communal, tribal communal college where they would have people come in and switch around, today you're going to be the teacher of, doing beading, or today you're going to teach us to go ice fishing, and everyone has those different skills that they are really good in. And so the hats, kind of gets placed around.
Yeah, so there isn't one authority figure all the time.
To ask you about connection to land, connection to place, and those ties, because I'm coming off of the high of going back home, right? I was, I haven't been there full time for more than, I guess even just a couple of weeks since I left for college, which was a long time ago. So there was a lot of learning and relearning and just remembering and reconnecting with place. I would go back and I would visit and I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm home. And, but this time it felt different because I was home to do work, number one, and I was home to, also I was bringing my partner for this project that I have. Her name's Jenna. She had never been to the Arctic before. She had never been to Barrow.
So that was like jumping in with cold both feet because that was a real cold snap when you were